Alright, y'all, so today in this canceled video, today I'm going to be talking about a version of a classic Marvel animated film that came out in the mid-2000s, and I want to talk about a version of that movie that we could have gotten instead of the one that got released in 2006. Of course, I'm going to be talking about the potentially canceled version of Ultimate Avengers that we could have gotten, a version that could have possibly changed the future of Marvel animation and how Avengers would be adapted into future films and animated properties, but just in general, possibly Marvel animation itself. This is kind of an interesting video, and I found some things related to Ultimate Avengers I just kind of wanted to make a video about and discuss some of the scrapped ideas and potentially different versions of the movie that we could have gotten instead, of course, the one that we did get in 2006 that was the direct-to-video Ultimate Avengers. So regardless, let's get into this. Of course, I'm going to kind of give you some background, some of the very few amounts of content I was able to kind of discover about this, and some trivia, my overall opinions, why I'm assuming it was scrapped, and, my general, I guess, opinions of it, like I already said. So regardless, let's get into it. So first, for a little bit of background, Marvel was kind of looking for ways to adapt their characters into other mediums. They were kind of looking for properties, and they were just in general trying to push the Marvel brand into a wider audience. And that's when they signed a deal with Lionsgate Home Entertainment for about 8 animated films. The idea behind this was that Marvel Animation, alongside a collaboration with Lionsgate themselves, and Lionsgate, of course, would distribute these, would basically make 8 direct-to-video films, with the possibility of a theatrical release. But they would make 8 of these movies, and the first of these movies that were going to be made was The Ultimate Avengers. And this was going to be kind of a loose adaptation of The Ultimates, and that was a comic that was released back in 2002, and it was kind of a modern retelling and take on the Avengers as part of the Ultimate Marvel Universe, which was a reboot of the Marvel Universe itself in comics, and it was a pretty huge success when it came out. Now, when Lionsgate and Marvel Animation was slowly working on this, there was a couple of ideas of how they were going to do the Ultimates, and it was a little bit tricky. One thing that they did do when they were working on this movie, which was starting to kick off around 2005, was that they actually got Mark Miller involved to help coordinate some of the story elements, and he even got Brian Hitch, who was the main artist on the Ultimates, to come together and basically kind of conjure up some concept art designs and help contribute to the visual look and adapting their comic to the direct-to-video screens. And also the idea of just kind of making it a more sanitized kid version of their comic, The Ultimates. Little fun fact, Brian Hitch also even kind of made designs for Ultimate Avengers too. He kind of created the look for Black Panther and the Wakanda society and tribes and stuff. Even though those characters and that whole world didn't appear in the Ultimates, it's really cool that he got involved to kind of imagine it in a lot of ways. So pretty cool stuff. Now, as they were kind of kicking off, they were starting to kind of come together and figure out how they're going to be able to do this, and starting to coordinate some story elements and, more importantly, animation. And they kind of did this less than a minute, I guess, this sort of test reel, kind of a pitch, if you will, animation video. And it kind of showcases some scenes from the Ultimates 1, where, the Avengers, or excuse me, the Ultimates are fighting Hulk in New York City, and he's kind of going out of control. And it takes a lot of scenes from that comic, but as you can tell, if you watch it on YouTube, which, I might put a link down in this video, who knows, it's taken directly from the comic. There's direct panels adapted here. Now, none of these scenes made it to the final movie, as we all know. The Hulk fight still ended up in the movie, but it was heavily reworked and heavily kind of redone in their own way. But this version hints that there could have been a version of Ultimate Avengers that would have sticked more closely to the source material. And there's, like I said before, in the little less than a minute animation reel, if you will, kind of a lot of scenes that are taken directly from the comic. Like, there's a scene where Giant Man pushes Hulk against a building. That happens in the comic. Iron Man kind of shoving Hulk into Central Station. That happened in the comic. Captain America going one-on-one with Hulk. That happened in the comic. Thor smash landing down into New York City to attack the Hulk. That happened in the comic, even a little grin before he says that very infamous line, which I'm not going to repeat in the comic. If you know, you know. And, like I said, it's just a very different animation style as well. Now, the quality online isn't great, and granted, it is a animation reel most likely made in 2006 or 2005. But as you can tell, there's a hugely different art style here. All the characters are really highly detailed. All the details on the body, their musculature, so to speak, the how big and imposing the art style is. The shadows are sharp and contrasted, and everything just looks more detailed. Even the city itself and the backgrounds. It looks more akin to an anime than it does in the final film, which was more I guess simpler 2D animated style. And yeah, so this animation reel kind of showcase a much more detailed, sophisticated, and even more anime-like style, even how the characters move. So that kind of hints what the original direction was for the Ultimate Avengers. So it's really interesting stuff. It also feels a little bit more closer to the original comics art style, the Ultimate. So that's really cool stuff. Now, ultimately, what happened to this, right? Why didn't we get a more closer adaptation to the Ultimates and Ultimate Avenger in an art style that was more akin to anime, more detailed, and more similar to the Ultimates? Well, we don't have too much information, but we can only really speculate on what really could have been. And so, like I said before, a really cool piece of kind of originally lost to media, but kind of found. Really cool stuff. But back to the topic at hand. Well, my assumption is, and like I said before, we just don't have too much information on this. My assumption is it just was too expensive to do that animation style for a whole film. As you can tell, it looked very expensive. All the characters are detailed, and it was also, more importantly, most likely a proof of concept. Marvel, Lionsgate probably looked at it and said, "Wow, this looks great." They couldn't afford to do it for a whole hour length feature. So they decided to scale back on the 2D animation and go for a little bit more of a simpler style. And obviously that probably helped because it was a little bit more productive. And they were eventually able to get the films out in 2006. And you have to remind yourself, too, they were making two of them. So they had to be very efficient in their animation and production cycle and stuff. So my assumption is it was probably a bit too expensive to do that version of the animation. But, like I said, it looks wildly different from the final film. Now, in terms of, while this, like, the animation reel we saw was wildly different and more accurate to the Ultimates, why did they deviate so much more than the source material, so to speak? Well, I think the source material really speaks for itself. While I really enjoy the Ultimates, there's a lot of Mark Millerisms. There's always a lot of weird moments in that comic. There's definitely a lot of things. And if you're trying to make a more PG, kid-friendly adaptation of the Ultimates, you're just going to have to sanitize and water things down. And that's probably what the team wanted to do. And they just wanted to make a loose adaptation of it. Even if you look at some of the featurettes on the DVD for this thing, they kind of say the same as much. And they just wanted to do a version of the Ultimates that was true to the story and concept and in nature, but kind of more loose in its adaptation and a little bit different. So they ultimately decided to do something that, obviously the Ultimates, adapting it would need some kind of adjustment, so they wanted to adjust the Ultimates to make it a kid-friendly feature and also kind of do their own thing. So that's why my assumption is why we never got this a little bit, was seemingly more accurate version of the Ultimates and Ultimate Avenger. Now, there's also some other really interesting tidbits as well. For example, why they decided to do 2D animation. Originally, they were actually briefly considering to do 3D animation, similar to the trend at the time with Pixar and stuff. But they felt like Marvel characters were already so expressive, and they also found value in 2D animated films. They thought there was still a market for them, and most likely, too, it was cheaper to do a 2D animated film. So they decided to stick with 2D animation. Even though the final films would have elements of 3D animation mixed in, it was mostly a 2D animated experience. So pretty cool and interesting stuff. And yeah, this is kind of a really interesting version of Ultimate Avengers that we could have gotten. More of an anime, more detailed, possibly more similar in story and concept to the original Ultimates. but ultimately was scrapped, most likely due to cost, time, and also just the nature of the source material itself. I think it's a bit of a shame we never got to see this art style realized to a overall hour length feature, just because I think the test reel that was made looks fantastic, but I also totally get the possible theories that it looked too expensive. And I mean, you got to be productive, and movies are a business at the end of the day. But still, it's a bit of a shame we never got to see this version of the movie. But I am glad that they make a lot of changes from the source material, as the source material of the Ultimates is pretty wild stuff. So I think it's a mixed bag overall, in my opinion, on this canceled version of Ultimate Avengers. But yeah, let me know what y'all think of this. If y'all even knew anything about this, definitely let me know if y'all get the chance to see this. If you definitely went to the end, thank you for listening. Hopefully, y'all have a good day and peace, y'all.